Did you know that there is no scientific consensus on what an emotion is? That makes me angry, disgusted, and saddened. I'm afraid that I require a definition for this common word. Otherwise, how will I ever be able to use it in good faith? Happily, my dedication to solving this problem led me down a rabbit hole that ended in some shocking conclusions. Hi, I'm Chris, and this is Behavioral Logic, where I talk about intelligent behavior in theory, practice, computers, and neuroscience. Welcome to a video that I wanted to call I Just Want a Scientific Definition of Emotion. Is that so hard? Why, yes, actually, it is. But that title was too long. I'll have to keep workshopping it. So what should we do to try and define this nebulous and contentious term? My plan is first to look through neuroscience and psychology references for any definition we can find, then critique and compare those definitions. Once we've squeezed everything out of that, I'll attempt to break down the concept of emotions into simpler parts that are hopefully a little easier to describe. After that, I'll use what we've learned to make the best definition of emotion that I can, or fail trying. My journey into this unexpected mystery started when I was reading my favorite online neuroscience resource, Neuroscience Online, and I came across this passage. The Papez circuit, like many other areas of the limbic system, is involved in learning and memory, emotion, and social behavior, and was originally thought by James Papez to be the anatomical substrate of emotional experience. The amygdala, along with neocortical areas, are now known to be centrally involved in emotional experience. Wow, that sounds really impressive, but what do they mean by emotion? I mean, I'm not being pedantic. I know what emotions are. I use that word all the time in casual conversation, but specifically, what psychological and physiological states are associated with emotions in a scientific context? Finding a scientific definition of emotion should be easy. I'll just look it up in the glossary. It seems that Neuroscience Online doesn't have a glossary. No matter. I'm sure I can find a good one on the web somewhere. This one looks good. NCBI is a very reputable science site. They offer a neuroscience textbook, and it has a glossary. Awesome. Let's check it out. Emotion should be between embryo and end plate current. That's a bit weird. No matter. I'll keep looking. Shouldn't be that hard. Here's a neuroscience glossary from the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. Seems legit. Okay. No definition of emotion here either. Okay. Principles of neurobiology? No. Brain U Neuroscience Glossary? Nope. Dana Foundation Neuroscience Glossary? No. Brainfacts.org? Nope. University of Alberta Neuroscience, A Journey Through the Britain? Nope. National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke? Nope. ResearchGate Glossary of Neuroscience? Whoa, this one is really thorough. There's like thousands of terms at nope. Maybe I just need to stop being lazy and relying on the internet so much. Let's go look at some dead tree versions. I was planning on going to the library, but I sort of ended up at John K. King Used Books in Detroit, so I figured I'd take advantage of the opportunity. Here's a nice one, Neuroscience, Exploring the Brain. No. But it does include an entire chapter on emotion. All right, I'm buying this. Biology, Principle and Explorations. No. Biology, The Network of Life. No. It seems like neuroscientists and biologists, they have a lot to say about emotion, so why are they so reluctant to define it? We find a clue in Current Biology, October 21, 2019, in this short debate on emotion between two neuroscientists called What is an Emotion? In it, it begins. In 1884, William James, the American psychologist, famously posed the question, what is an emotion? After more than a century of scientific inquiry, however, emotions remain essentially contested concepts. Scientists disagree on how they should be defined, on where to draw the boundaries for what counts as an emotion and what does not, on whether conscious experiences are central or epiphenomenal, and so on. Such disputes have sown great discord among scientists, leaving the field in perpetual upheaval, and without a unified framework for guiding scientific inquiry and accumulating knowledge. Oh, I see now. What you're saying is it's a show. Total cluster fudge. Great. I read the rest of that article, and sadly, not very constructive unless you happen to be looking for evidence of the previously mentioned discord and upheaval. This is not going to be as easy as looking up a definition in a glossary, is it? But it's important. I believe it's important. So I guess I'm going to have to put more work into it, which sucks, because today I wanted to watch streaming media while also playing games on my phone. But, well, whatever. Science calls. Let's keep looking. Oh, look, I found one. Essentials of Psychology and Life defines emotion as a complex, subjective psychological process which may be induced by environmental stimuli and mediated by physiological variables. It may have the power to motivate an organism to action. It is a felt tendency toward stimuli appraised as good and away from those appraised as bad. It's not a very good definition, is it? But you know what? At least they're trying. More than I can say for the neuroscientists. Ah, and I see why. This is a psychology book. Apparently the psychologists actually have the guts to try to define this, so good for them. It starts with a complex, subjective psychological process. Oh, yeah. You know what other things are complex, subjective psychological processes in your brain? All of them. That's not helpful. Then they start using may, weasel words like may, could, usually, possibly, don't really belong in a definition. I need a definition to tell me if something qualifies or doesn't, not that it could be an emotion. I don't know. I mean, maybe. How is that even helpful? The last sentence, it is a felt tendency toward stimuli appraised as good and away from those appraised as bad. That's kind of interesting. We should definitely come back to that later. Oh my gosh, look, it has a whole chapter on motivation and emotion. I'm buying this one too. It was only $3. Well, now that we know that psychologists aren't afraid or are foolish enough to attempt to define emotions, let's see what else they have. In Wikipedia, it says, emotions are physical and mental states brought on by neurophysiological changes, variously associated with thoughts, feelings, behavioral responses, and a degree of pleasure or displeasure. There is no scientific consensus on a definition. So, all emotions are physical and mental states brought on by physical and mental changes. I don't even know what that's saying. Let's see, we've got some terms in there that definitely need further definition. But you know what? I like how it ends. They are totally open about the lack of scientific consensus. So it seems like we are getting consensus on the fact that there is no consensus. A lot of these definitions like to use the adjective complex. That isn't very helpful, but it's not wrong either. It probably means that we're going to have to break this concept of emotions down into some simpler parts. Here's a PDF from the University of West Alabama online. That is not the most prestigious institution I've heard of, but you know what? This is one of the best sources I've been able to find. It's informative and it succinctly summarizes emotional psychology, its history, and current state. So I don't know who wrote it, but thanks. Here's a few important things they mention. Emotions are often confused with feelings and moods, but the three terms are not interchangeable. Okay, Yeah, now we need to define feelings and moods, but I was already talking about breaking emotions down into smaller parts, so this could be a good direction. Emotional experiences have three components: a subjective experience, a physiological response, and a behavioral or expressive response. These are also plausible avenues to pursue the breakdown of emotion into simpler parts. We definitely need to look into that a little more. Defining emotions is a task that is not yet complete. Many researchers are still proposing theories about what makes up our emotions, and existing theories are constantly being challenged. You know, I'm treating an admission that we don't really agree on what emotions are as a really good sign. Anybody who says that, I think they're not just making stuff up. They're being honest. In fact, at this point, the fact that nobody agrees on what an emotion is kind of the only definitive conclusion that I've been able to make. Here's one from the Oxford Dictionary of Nursing: a state of arousal that can be experienced as pleasant or unpleasant. Emotions can have three components. For example, fear can involve an unpleasant subjective experience, an increase in physiological measures such as heart rate, and a tendency to flee from the situation provoking fear. Here's another definition that mentions that three-component model. Neither source gave a reference, and I haven't been able to find the original source yet, but I like it. That's good enough for me. The Dictionary of Psychology. Holy cats, this definition is 2 pages long. More of an essay than a definition. Still, $2.95? Yeah, I bought it. I read through the definition, and to save time, I won't read you the whole thing. One thing a lot of these definitions keep bringing up is the concept of feelings. Maybe if we can determine what feelings are, it'll help us figure out at least some of this puzzle. The Dictionary of Psychology has a nice succinct entry on its many meanings. Most generally, any conscious state or experience. 2. Specifically an affective or emotional state. 3. Titchener. One of the elements of consciousness. The primary dimensions of feeling is pleasantness, unpleasantness. Synonym: affective state. 4. The sense of touch. 5. An intuitive belief. It sure seems like feelings can mean many different things in different contexts. Let's take a look at this synonym, affective state. An emotional state. 2. Titchener. Pleasantness or unpleasantness. This Titchener guy seems kind of important. The sensations of pleasure and pain, that seems pretty straightforward. I do prefer the use of unpleasantness instead of pain, because most of our negative feelings of situations are more like boredom or impatience or mild disappointment. They don't really rise to the level of what most people, I think, would consider pain, but they're still not good. This affective state concept sounds similar to the part in the first psychological definition: a felt tendency toward stimuli appraised as good and away from those appraised as bad. But if feelings tell us what is good and what is bad, how do they affect behavior so that we can be attracted to the good things and avoid the bad things? Well, I'm so glad you asked that, Chris. Why, thank you. It was right in the script. And to find out the answer to that, we need to take a look at behavioral conditioning. The simplest type of behavior conditioning is called operant or instrumental conditioning. In this example, we have 2 buttons. What happens when we press them? Well, we don't know yet, so we know there's a 50-50 chance that we're going to push one or the other, so let's roll a die and see what we get. 3. We'll push the red one. Ooh, a Starlight Mint. Well, I'm eating that. That was a pleasurable experience. We'll give that a pleasantness value of +1. Okay, let's roll again. 6. Push the white one. Well, that was moderately unpleasant. We'll give that an unpleasantness value of -1. Now, We can use those values of pleasantness and unpleasantness in a crude way to adjust the odds. We'll add 1 to the values for the red button and subtract 1 from the white button. You can see the result of this will change the odds of pushing the pleasant button over the unpleasant button. Now that our system has learned from its successes and failures, let's get some more candy and do this some more. I highly doubt that this is the exact mathematical model that our brains use to improve our behavior, but it's probably something along these lines. It's just a simple algorithmic model of how an intelligent agent can become attracted to actions that evaluate as pleasant and learn to avoid actions that evaluate unpleasantly. But now, what if this happens? We're going to get 2 new buttons, similar to the first 2. When we push the greenish button, we're going to get a red button as the consequent effect. When we push the blue button, well, that causes a white button to appear. What are the pleasantness and unpleasantness values for these? We don't have any. The system I made has candy and zaps sort of intrinsically associated with pleasantness values. It doesn't know what it feels seeing colored buttons, but what if it could learn that? Let's bring up the table that we used to intrinsically determine pleasantness values. Before we started, I had already set the Starlight Mint to be +1 and the Zap to be -1. But what if, after our first-hand experience from the red and white buttons, we could add information to this table? We know that the red button caused a +1 and the white button resulted in a -1. We can choose to discount these values because they are indirectly related, so let's cut them in half. This is the simplest example of classical conditioning I could think of. Now, let's go backwards to our second scenario. Using our new pleasantness and unpleasantness table, simply recognizing a red or white button will result in a positive or negative feeling. Now, when we rerun the second demonstration, the behavior is tuned toward the greenish button and away from the blue button. But the updates to pleasantness values are still in effect. We can even add more new information. This effect can go on forever and be stronger or weaker depending on the amount of discounting. I chose 50% just to make the math easy. Intellectual agents that use classical conditioning algorithms, like your own brain, quickly associate positive and negative opinions to the recognition of every single object previously encountered. All that we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch that was associated with any amount of enjoyment or discomfort will forever be associated with those feelings, even if maybe they are not the direct cause of them. Look around you. Nearly every single object you see can trigger feelings, happiness, regret, frustration, satisfaction, and memories related to its recognition. After many years of experience, very few recognizable objects will still not have any gut, approval, or dislike. What do you think we should call this pleasantness or unpleasantness value? I like the term feelings, but that word has so many other meanings depending on context. I worry it's a little ambiguous. Affective state is a little jargony for me because nobody's going to know what you're talking about. Similar algorithms used in reinforcement learning call this Q star, the value function. I like to think of them as subjective senses because they don't just recognize shapes or sounds or smells. They only signal whether something is good or bad. I like that term, but nobody else uses it, so it's not very effective communication. I guess I've been using pleasantness in the example. I'll keep using that terminology until I can think of something better. In the previously mentioned three-component model of emotion, subjective, physiological, and behavioral, if we consider this pleasantness value to represent the subjective part, I think that's pretty good. We've already shown a mathematical model and its role in behavior conditioning. Doesn't get more rigorous than that. It's very observable, and it relies on accepted research. Okay, one component down, two to go. I knew this was going to be a lot of work, but I think we've hit some success so far. So yeah, let's keep going. In the 1970s, psychologist Paul Ekman studied cross-cultural facial recognition of 6 emotions: happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, and disgust. Though he called them joy, loneliness, fear, wrath, shock, and grossness. Then in 1999, he added embarrassment, excitement, contempt, shame, pride, satisfaction, and amusement, but those have not really caught on well in the psychological community. If Pixar's Inside Out didn't lie to all of us, these are all examples of key emotions. Let's dig into one that we know a lot about: fear. Let's take a look at the behavioral response. The stress response associated with fear is sometimes referred to as fight or flight. So, there's 2 possible actions right there as a response to danger. Later, they added freeze and fawn. Fawning refers to displaying submission to another of your own species to beg them to not hurt you.
Say uncle! Uncle! Uncle!
Know if you have any experience with that. Sometimes I also see flop, fainting in response to stress, or even better, playing dead. My favorite death feigning animal is the hognose snake. Their death scenes are worthy of Shakespeare. Look at these little guys. They don't know if they were dead, they wouldn't be able to flop over again. They are the master thespians of the serpent world. I just love them. Fight or flight was conceptualized in the 1920s. Freeze wasn't considered until the 70s, and the others added later. Will there be more options in the future? I can't be certain, except that whatever it is, it will have to start with the letter F. As diverse as these actions are, they are all different tactics to achieve the same goal: avoiding imminent doom. Fear is a reaction to a threat of immediate harm, and the creature needs to act to prevent it quickly, like their life depends on it, because it might. Avoiding injury and death is a goal that most biological organisms have, and during typical behavior, it's balanced with other important goals like seeking food and shelter, and the most important goal of all life, reproduction. If that wasn't the most important goal, then the creatures wouldn't be around to have goals. But when the stress response is triggered, all of those other goals are no longer important. The entire focus of the creature is now 100% focused on escaping harm. And that makes good sense. You'll never be able to achieve any of your other goals if you are critically injured or worse. Fear doesn't determine actions, but it does seem to shift focus to a pre-existing goal to the exclusion of others. What happens physiologically? What happens to our bodies when we are afraid is well documented. Our heart rate increases, our sweating increases, digestion decreases, energy stores in the liver are marshaled, and many other physiological changes, some we may not even know about yet. This is called the stress response, and it starts in the hypothalamus, where, on detection of an emergency, it secretes corticotropin-releasing factor into blood vessels that are connected to the anterior pituitary, which then secretes adrenocorticotropin into the main circulatory system, which then signals the adrenal glands to produce cortisol, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. These stress hormones, cortisol is considered to be the primary stress hormone, affect the functions of the circulatory system, the immune system, the digestive system, general metabolism, nearly all aspects of the body. Are there other physiological responses that are similar to fear? Fear is a great example of what we classify as an emotion. It has a subjective component, firmly in the unpleasantness side of that spectrum. It is associated with actions, the 5 F's, and the fear facial expression. And it has a strong physiological component with the stress response. It clearly shows all three of the 3-component model of emotion. But what other behavioral and physiological states are similar to the stress response? The hypothalamus is where the fear response begins, but what else does the hypothalamus do? One of its several important regulatory responsibilities is circadian rhythms, keeping track of the cycle of night and day for the timing of sleep and wakefulness. The hypothalamus sends signals to the pineal gland to produce or stop producing melatonin, a hormone that affects many parts of the body in preparation for sleep. This is a similar but simpler type of hormone-mediated physiological state, like the stress response. There is a mild but real subjective component. Being tired can be unpleasant. There is also a clear action associated with the mental state, such as looking for a safe and comfortable place to take a rest. I would argue that there is even a universal, though subtle, facial expression associated with looking tired. But sleepiness is not on any of the lists of emotions that I found. Why? I legitimately don't understand. It doesn't make any sense to me. Are there any other behavior regulations of the hypothalamus that we should consider? Well, appetite is an important one, though this process is a little backward to the stress and sleepiness ones. The initial chemical signals originate from the digestive system and adipose fat-storing tissue, and they send their signal to the hypothalamus through the bloodstream, and the hypothalamus uses that to control appetite and satiety. In addition to this physiological component, there is a subjective component, being hungry can suck, and a behavioral one, such as looking for something to eat. This satisfies the 3-component model. There doesn't seem to be any cross-cultural facial expression for hunger. Is that why we don't consider hunger to be an emotion? Is an emotional state not real unless we're making the face? Like corticotropin releasing factor, another endocrine initiation chemical that the hypothalamus secretes is luteinizing hormone releasing hormone. This signals the anterior pituitary to release luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, which affect sexual behavior and arousal. Is horniness an emotion? I mean, sexual arousal does have a subjective component. Mating is often described as pleasurable in the literature. It has related actions, flirting or making your move or whatever, in addition to the physiological hormonal system. There is no clear acultural facial expression associated with sexual arousal, like hunger. So this isn't classified as an emotion, even though it's clearly a pretty emotional experience. Now let's take a look at those 6 core emotions and see how they compare to the 3-component model. Happiness has an obvious subjective component on the pleasantness scale. In fact, that's almost all it is. There do seem to be hormones associated with happiness, like endorphins, but there really aren't any standard reactions to being happy, are there? I have a hard time considering happiness or joy or whatever it's called to be a real emotion, unless we also admit that being in pain is an emotion. This is a really simple psychological state that does not have an obvious behavioral component. Sadness is an unpleasant emotion. I think we all agree. The pain of loss seems to echo similar responses to physical injury, like needing to find a safe place to rest and heal. Psychological and neuroscientific literature seem to suggest this involves the parasympathetic parts of the autonomic nervous system. I don't really know much about it, but that seems to be enough for me to quickly assess that sadness seems to fulfill the three components of emotions. Moving on, fear, we've already talked about, but what about anger? Is anger just the fight reaction to fear? I don't know, maybe. If so, it clearly satisfies the three components too, but it's really only a minor variation of fear, I would say. I don't see how surprise is an emotion at all. It definitely activates the stress response, gets your heart pumping, so there's definitely a physiological component, but it doesn't have a subjective one. Somebody could feel surprised in the exact same way to someone like unexpectedly popping out at them, even before that person yells, "I'm gonna punch you in the face," or "Happy birthday." And very quickly that would turn the surprise into either fear or excitement. Surprise seems to be about the initial shock before a positive or negative assessment can really be made. And if we don't even have time to know if the surprise is good or bad, how can we reliably associate an appropriate reaction? Disgust is a little more subtle. It has a clear negative subjective reaction, but is there a physiological one? I think so. I mean, extreme disgust can cause vomiting. That is definitely a physiological reaction. And I've read that estrogen and progesterone are associated with the increase in nausea during pregnancy. As for related actions, I imagine disgust results in avoidance behaviors, though I could see maybe stepping on a gross bug could be a plausible reaction as well. Disgust definitely satisfies the three-component model of emotion. Wow, I have been learning so much about emotions. I still don't know what they are, but at this point, I feel like I have enough information to properly articulate the problem. Defining emotions based on acultural facial expressions, it results in a very meager list. Also, we have to assume that all facial expressions relate one-to-one to all possible emotions and only emotions, not any other type of communication of mental state. And that learned facial expressions have nothing to do with emotions. These are some bold assumptions that I find difficult to accept. I don't want this to sound like a criticism of Ekman's work because I think his results are fantastic. This is some of the best rigorous data available relating to the psychology of emotion out there. But maybe these inconsistencies are more our fault for reading into it a little more than it warrants. But when we use the three-component definition of emotion, we find a lot more behavioral and physiological states like hunger and sleepiness that aren't typically included in the common meanings of emotion. I can't be certain right now what the title and thumbnail of this video are, but my original title was Emotions Aren't Real. I figured it was good bait to get people to hate watch. If you've made it this far, I hope that you've become aware of new information that is of interest to you. And as hyperbolic as I decided my rage bait headline to be, I don't think it was dishonest. After examining all of the evidence, I think it's essentially what I feel like I have to conclude. Not that things like happiness and fear and sadness aren't real. They are. They're clearly real. They're well documented. But their classification as emotions is essentially meaningless. Why is surprise considered an emotion and hunger not? I've not been able to find any rational justification. But having delved into the subjective feelings of pleasantness and unpleasantness, and how they work to condition behavior and opinions, plus some of the hormonal systems that affect the body, Are there any significant psychological states that we cannot effectively describe without the need for the term emotions? I haven't discovered any yet, but until then, I don't really see the need to ever use the term emotion again. Then in casual conversation, of course, but never in any rigorous scientific context. Maybe I've missed something. Tomorrow, maybe there'll be a new study which will illuminate the classification of a universal expression of emotion. Who knows? But right now, I just don't see any value in a nebulous and non-exhaustive grouping of arbitrary physiological and psychological states. I think the neuroscience textbooks nearly had it right. There isn't a need to include emotions in their glossary. But I think they should take the next logical step and also remove the word from the text. And if you disagree, please, I would deeply appreciate being shown observable, rational evidence that disproves this conclusion. I don't want to be wrong. It'll just make me look dumb. The comments of this video are a great place to leave that contrary information. Please go ahead. I dare you. Oh, what a troll. I must be desperate for views. I am desperate for views. Emotions aren't real. What even is real? Well, Morpheus, if you're so curious, I am working on a video about how to prove if something is real or not. So if that interests you, subscribe, ring the bell, you know the drill. If this is thousands of years in the future after I've already made the video, well, maybe you can watch it right here.